Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this final session of the BRICS Business Council set of webinars that's sponsored by the IDC and 274. I'm Chad Potter, senior member in the private markets team at 274, and I'll be moderating this session between our experienced panelists we have with us today. At the end of the discussion, we will be reserving some time for questions from the audience. So please ask these through the Q&A chat or the chat room itself, and I'll look at sort of what are interesting, relevant ones for me to ask the panelists at the end. So today's discussion will focus on the SA's infrastructure program and how it is expected to drive economic recovery post-COVID. The focus of the session will be on the session will focus on one sort of government's priority projects and the readiness of these to actually implement and execute on. Just how far away are these from execution? The role of the infrastructure fund in terms of coordinating and supporting the implementation of these projects and then crowding in private sector funding. Public-private partnerships and the regulatory frameworks being developed to provide investors with confidence to invest in these programs. What the expected timeframes are from feasibility to commissioning of their prioritized projects, just how and how they look. Are we still a while away from these actually being ready for investment? And then finally, just discussing a bit about what sort of structural constraints are hindering this investment and potential for economic growth. So firstly, I'd like to welcome and thank our panelists of experts for taking part in the session. Today we have with us Mohale Regate, who is the Group Executive of the Infrastructure Fund, a ring-fenced division at the DBSA, tasked with government's initiative to transform the current infrastructure funding mechanism to become a blended financing platform for utilizing co-financing and blended financing solutions. We've got with us Vuyo Ntoy, who is the co-managing director of Africa Infrastructure Investment Managers, or AIM. He has over 2 decades of investment experience and has been involved in private infrastructure investing throughout Africa since 2003. And then we have Anant Madhavan, who's replaced Samir Bhatti, who you may have seen on the panelist notification. Unfortunately, Samir can't be with us today. So Anant, who is a director of Infrastructure and Public Finance at CRISIL Infrastructure Advisory, has stepped in to add to the discussion. Anant has worked with governments across Africa in establishing infrastructure development frameworks and public-private partnership enabling mechanisms. So comes with a wealth, I guess, of experience around infrastructure policy, development, and transaction advisory services. So from in terms of what the panelists are going to be bringing to the discussion, I think from Mohale's side, we are looking for insight into the infrastructure fund and getting insight into how the public sector is looking at how this will work with the private sector. And from Vuyo and Anant's perspective, we hopefully be able to leverage of their experience as private sector investors and consultants in this space as well to have an engaging discussion between the 3 of them. So without further ado, I'm going to jump straight into the questions and start off with Mohale to introduce the infrastructure fund to us. So Mohale, I guess the government has gazetted a list of 50 projects and 12 special projects for potential investment across 6 main sectors. Given government's limited finances, there's a greater need for it to create an enabling environment for effective partnerships with the private sector. I think this is one of the roles that a key role that the infrastructure fund is meant to be playing in opening these opportunities to the private sector. From your side, can you describe the role of the infrastructure fund in a bit more detail to the audience and how it will assist in enhancing collaboration and attracting private sector investment to support the government's strategic integrated projects, and more specifically as well, just sort of setting out what the responsibilities between, I guess, the DBSA, National Treasury, and the Department of Public Works is in terms of that partnership around the infrastructure fund.
Okay, no, thank you very much, Chad, and greetings to the other panel members and the audience at large. Just as a background, the IF, which we call Infrastructure Fund in full, is a result of the government through the president pronouncing that infrastructure will be the flywheel for the economic growth that South Africa needs. And the basis is that currently South Africa is experiencing or recording 18% of GDP in terms of gross capital formation. And the optimal number or aspiration should be 30%. So there's a gap between 18 and 30 of 12. And that's where we need to go to as a country, so that we remove the constraints, to economic growth, so that we go beyond 5% in the long term, which will enable the country to address, the triple challenges of inequality, joblessness, and also lack of growth. Yeah. So as a result, then government focused on the ecosystem. To create, an ecosystem that facilitates the development of infrastructure and implementation thereof at scale and with speed. But that's where now, if you look back from 2019, when the president announced that in his State of the Nation address, he has since, spearheaded the development and establishment of ISA, Infrastructure South Africa, under the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure, and the Infrastructure Fund also created as a result of those efforts. And basically, Infrastructure Fund is a creature of a memorandum of agreement, and no different from the IPP office. In the case of the Infrastructure Fund, is between National Treasury, ISA, and the DBSA. In the case of the IPP office, again, just for comparison, it's a National Treasury, Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, and the DBSA. So Treasury and DBSA are common denominators in both initiatives. The difference is the mandating authority. So in terms of the roles and responsibilities, ISA is really the the mandating authority. The idea is that ISA would spearhead the development of a national infrastructure plan, which is a sub-plan of the NDP, the National Development Plan. And out of that, there would be a priority of priority projects that would need to be implemented. And those would span from projects or programs that can be 100% funded by the fiscus, those that can be fully commercially funded, and those that lend themselves to blended finance, in which case those would be channeled through to the infrastructure fund, because we are a blended finance platform where we leverage state resources to crowd in private sector. So that's the role of ISA on the pipeline, on the unblocking, prioritization, and generally setting the objectives for the infrastructure fund. National Treasury comes in insofar as the budgeting process for the public resources is coming in. There's 100 billion allocated over the next 10 years, of which 18 billion has been made available in the last budget over the 3-year term. In 4 million this year, 4 billion this year, 6 billion next year, and then the 8 billion in the outer year. So there's clear commitment from government in that regard. And then the DBSA was tasked with managing the establishment of the fund, and as a ring-fenced entity, just like the IPP office, to focus on structuring the projects, getting public resources leveraged with the public sector participation, both from a development perspective as well as crowding in financing, and also from the DFIs, by the way. So what the ultimate objective is, over 10 years, we need to leverage the 100 billion at least 10 times to 1 trillion we would say we have done our job if we can achieve that. And sector-wise, it's sectors across the board, infrastructure-wise, except IPP programs, which are done by the IPP office. So that's in a nutshell what the IF is about and the ecosystem. We can maybe delve more as we proceed into the details. Thank you.
Thanks, Male. Maybe just before I bring the other panelists in, so one area that I myself am interested in and understanding a bit more about is sort of I guess the list of strategic integrated projects that have been gazetted by government, and just how ready some of those projects are for private sector investment. So what still needs to be done from a government perspective, from a DBA perspective, to get those there, to actually catalyze private sector capital alongside the blended finance being provided through the infrastructure fund. If you maybe can talk to, I guess, a few examples.
Yes. So fortunately, with foresight, even before the infrastructure fund MOA was signed in August last year, already a year before then, National Treasury made available 400 million to DBSA through another agreement, a bilateral agreement, to start preparing projects that would be, advanced on the IF platform. In there, and it's public knowledge, we're talking about the student housing program. It's a big program to address 300,000 backlogs in student accommodation in the tertiary sector. You have SA Connect, it's around the digital connectivity, and also the water projects, which will lead to the water programs, basically in the municipal space. And the student housing program is well advanced. In fact, there's been a pilot done on a number of universities, projects, and they've been funded. So now, as I say, now we're moving into the second phase to do 25,000 beds. We are approaching, the BFI process. BFI is the Treasury budget process to access that public sector funding, where now we're going to blend it with private sector, quite advanced. So within this calendar year, we should be closing, the 25,000 beds that we talking to in the space of, student housing. And SA Connect, the feasibility study was completed in December. And again, there we're talking, a program of around 60 billion when rolled out to make sure that unconnected spaces in South Africa are also brought on board. The feasibility is done. We're waiting for approval of the feasibility from the department. This is the Department of Communication and Digital Technologies. That program should be rolled out as well. Feasibility studies are ongoing on the water projects. We have 7 of them, which are a pilot, to introduce private sector participation in the water treatment and reticulation spaces in municipalities. So those should be ready more early next year, not in the current year. So the former 2 that I spoke about, within this calendar year, we should be starting to see projects being closed and the private sector being invited, and construction probably starting in the first quarter of next year. Certainly so for the student housing program, which, as I say, is ongoing. And in addition to that, there are lots of other projects that would have been in the system where, feasibility studies would have been done, but they lack, one or so credit enhancement initiatives. And those have approached us, or we have approached them, meaning the government departments and relevant state-owned companies. It would be in the water sectors, in other instances, it would be in the logistics space or transport stage, spaces. So again, there, it's a question of structuring those. We may see 1 or 2 in the current, again, calendar year, coming through. We are also submitting those to access, the part of the 100 billion in order to blend. So whilst we are really establishing the infrastructure fund, we have a team, the core team of no less than 10 that we have already managed to bring in. We are also looking at the pipeline, and we should be seeing projects sooner than later, as I say. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohale. Maybe just to sort of open up to Anant and Vuyo, and I guess you've heard what Mohale had to say about, I guess, where the government and where the DBSA from an infrastructure fund perspective is with the rollout of the SIPS program and the feasibility thereof. From your perspective, what do you see as sort of the critical challenges facing the government's infrastructure program and really accelerating that rollout for private sector investments? What are the areas that still need to be addressed, need to be solved to encourage investment, particularly from, I guess, yourself, Vuyo, as a allocator of capital for pension funds, and Anant, from a consulting perspective, what do you see as sort of the areas that could be addressed, and examples of things that you've seen elsewhere for the likes, similar to what you've told me about in terms of what India is doing? I'll let one of you, which one? Maybe
okay.
Vuyo, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I'm happy to go. And again, thanks for having me on the panel. It's a pleasure, and to my panel mates, it's a privilege to be on the same panel as yourselves. I think, Chad, it's all positive. It's a positive story. So, the likes of ourselves establish businesses that look to, sustainably invest in projects, and we can sustain ourselves if there's a steady flow of projects that we can invest in. And essentially, we've set up shop to over the long term channel pension fund money into critical infrastructure projects for the country. And our complaint in the past has really been the fact that there's not enough bankable projects coming through for us to invest in. So it's never been about a lack of capital. It's always been about a lack of bankable projects. And what we've had to do in the past and in more recent times has been either putting in additional risk capital to sort of assist in getting projects to bankability. And that's quite risky because obviously the ratio of projects that get developed to those that actually reach close is limited. It then means that the likes of ourselves are taking on more risks than a normal infrastructure fund investor would be taking, because there's a development element as well involved. And then there's also kind of the issue of scale and predictability. So I think, the infrastructure fund and Infrastructure South Africa and how it's approaching this is going about it in the right way, i.e. It looks like the projects that are being developed are projects that will have sufficient scale to attract scalable investments and therefore enjoy, the economies that come with the scale that they bring, and also predictability. I think what's important is for entities such as ourselves who are looking to channel the money, if there's no steady flow of projects coming to the market, it's very hard to sustain ourselves and sustain an environment where there's active investment in infrastructure projects. So I think that's the positives. I think in terms of where the potential challenges are, I think it's timing. So again, how soon will we see scalable projects coming to the market? The sectors as well. We see kind of the projects we've seen, or those that are likely to come through in the short term, are projects in let's call it more traditional sectors. So I think the technology around tertiary accommodation is a well-developed technology. So I think what we need to start seeing, and what we'd like to see and protect, and I think the water space will probably open these up a bit, is structuring projects in previously difficult sectors, such as water, in a way that allows long-term pension money to invest. And that's what we really look forward to. The other area where there's concern, and maybe I'm contradicting myself here, is I spoke earlier about the fact that the real shortfall is in bankable projects rather than money. But I think on the pension side as well, as you know, Regulation 28, which governs the extent to which and the types of infrastructure projects that pension funds can invest in, is still under development. And we think that the current draft of the regulation still requires quite a bit of work. And in fact, the current draft, as it's currently put, almost essentially puts a cap on the amount of infrastructure that can be invested in, which is almost kind of the opposite of what government's trying to achieve. And we believe that sort of opening up infrastructure and, in effect, it's a less risky asset class. So we believe that you shouldn't be capping it unnaturally. You should be allowing pension funds to invest according to their risk appetite after the trustees have sort of looked at what their risk appetite is. And but otherwise, I think it's the whole trajectory is positive, and South Africa has typically been a leader on the project side. I mean, the IPP office is world renowned on putting out kind of transparent processes for the award of projects. Before that, the PPP office in Treasury had also been quite successful. Good kind of PPP accommodation projects have come out of there, as well as the toll road program. So South Africa is certainly a leader on the continent. I mean, across the rest of the continent, the issue of scale and predictability is even a bigger challenge, i.e. lots of projects are individually or bilaterally negotiated, which sort of reduces the extent to which frameworks for predictable and ongoing project delivery can be developed. So I think South Africa is through the Infrastructure South Africa and the Infrastructure Fund putting itself on the front foot and taking an even more leading position from an infrastructure delivery perspective.
Thanks for you. I'd like to pick up on Reg 28 after Ananda has his chance to talk as well.
I think if I step back and I just like to sort of approach the answer to some of the questions you asked from three dimensions really. I think one is the context. I mean, South Africa has seen an economics growth slowdown, right? Even pre-COVID, and so there is an economic context, and the government has rightly identified infrastructure investment and development as something which can give a multiplier to the whole growth story. So I think from a policy perspective, I think there is clear identification that this is something that South Africa needs to do. And directionally, like you mentioned, I mean, the setting up of the infrastructure fund, the identification of the SIPs, all augur well from a directional standpoint there. The allocation of 100 billion that Mohale mentioned, and the mandate to the infrastructure fund to leverage that. So from a directional perspective, I think giving this fillip to infrastructure in terms of scale is a very, very positive development. Like we all mentioned, I don't think South Africa is new to PPPs or infrastructure. I think there's been a track record of projects developed. In fact, to tell you, I was part of the team which actually worked with the G20 Global Infrastructure Hub to look at project preparation practices across the globe. And we had put up a reference toolkit for project preparation as part of that exercise. And we looked very closely at the REIPP program and even put it as a case study in our document we had prepared for the Global Infrastructure Hub. So there are a lot of good practices and lessons South Africa already has from some of the programs and private sector investments that it has crowded in. I also like the fact that Mr. Mohale mentioned that the infrastructure fund as a blended finance initiative, and I like the term because very often many countries we have worked with tend to look at infrastructure fund as a purely private initiative, but there's very clearly a recognition from what Mr. Mohale mentioned that infrastructure projects clearly require that government support, clearly required a blended financing angle, and the objective is to use this 100 billion to crowd in sort of private sector money through good structuring, well prepared projects. And so therefore the directional approach that South Africa seems to be taking seems in a very correct order. I think the key is going to be, like they say, the devil is in the detail, right? I mean, so the key is, in terms of how do we put the nuts and bolts to sort of actually operationalize this vision, right? And I think the institutional arrangements that South Africa has, be it the ISA or DBSA and the infrastructure fund, the identification of SIPs, I think there is a good platform to put some of those nuts and bolts in a slightly scaled up manner. For example, just reacting to Mr. Vio's point, can we have a far more structured development and project preparation in a time-bound manner, in a plug-and-play fashion, which gives comfort to investors like Mr. Vio? So I think that is, so the nuts and bolts is something which may need to be focused on. I'll probably talk about that a little more as we move forward in this session, but those are probably some of my initial remarks and reactions to what I hear from my co-panelists here.
Thanks, Anand. Vuyo, I just wanted to pick up before we move on to some of the other elements around the discussion, just on Reg 28 and specifically around what you meant by, I guess, the cap that's been put in place there, and how you see, or what from your perspective, from an AIM perspective, you'd want to see change to I guess encourage trustees of pension funds to actually look at infrastructure as a real asset class that they could invest in with relatively low risk associated with it.
Thanks, Chad. I mean, yeah, no. I mean, again, directionally, the fact that infrastructure, for instance, has been separated from private equity and hedge funds in terms of sector is good. Although the truth is, infrastructure itself is not really an asset class, right? It's an industrial sector. So essentially, the way that it's been done has been to sort of identify infrastructure as an industrial sector, which then gets capped within the various asset classes. So within equity, there's a cap on how much infrastructure can be invested. There's within listed debt and unlisted debt, there's similarly caps. So our view on it is, don't cap the extent to which infrastructure can be invested. Open it up. You might find that you're actually, to the extent projects get developed, you're actually limiting funding sources for projects if you do that. But I mean, I think directionally, though, the idea of having more allocation to infrastructure, I think the main aim, or the way it seems to me, of the draft as it currently stands, is to increase reporting, so that once you have to report on something, it's front of mind, and it means trustees actually have to actively engage with how much infrastructure they're allocating in their various portfolios. And I think if it's a reporting requirement, I think then that's fine. Then pension funds can adequately report on how much infrastructure they're investing, and regulators and policymakers can then make the right sort of encourage pension funds directly based on the information they get from such reporting. Furthermore, I mean, I think industry bodies such as ASISA are already, yes, they've got their slightly different definition of what infrastructure is or should be. And they're already, I think, reporting into industry associations where government and the private sector come together on exactly how much is being allocated to infrastructure from a private savings perspective. So, I think that virtuous reporting cycle is already underway, and what we're really saying is don't cap allocations to infrastructure. Rather encourage, yes, seek reporting, and that can be the basis on which you make policy pronouncements, is the results of that reporting.
Okay, thanks, Vuyo. So Mohale, I think Vuyo is sort of saying don't cap RIG 28 around sort of around the ability to sort of invest in infrastructure. I think Anand mentioned that the devil's in the detail around how this infrastructure program is actually going to work. From your perspective of the infrastructure fund and the DBSA perspective, I mean, this is an ambitious program that the government sort of embarking on. How do you foster and how do you set up that environment to ensure collaboration amongst all stakeholders and give people the comfort to invest in, especially pension funds and pension fund trustees, the comfort to invest in these programs that are being rolled out by the government?
No, thanks, Chad. I think it's an interesting one. I think at the core, what we see as a major challenge from both the infrastructure fund and on the government side, ISA, we are fully aligned, is to ensure that, precisely we build, strong governance structures, around, the ecosystem, ensure that the transparency is key, predictability, standardize the documents, ensure that, there's a steady flow of projects. So for us, and it's based also on interactions with key stakeholders, ASISAs, the BASAs, and also on a bilateral basis with, asset managers, your pension funds. That's what they're looking for. So what we're trying to solve for is on the supply side of infrastructure projects. I think the demand side for us, I think, is less of a challenge from our interactions. Demand side meaning, developers who would gladly participate, if they are offered opportunities for concessions. Similarly, from the financing side, your asset managers, your, fund managers, as we were saying, even the banks. I mean, you look at the IPP programs, which we are proud of, because DBSA incubated the IPP office from 2010, and I was fortunate to be part of that process from then. I recently moved on to the IF. I had been involved for more than 10 years in the program. So there are serious lessons from that program, and we don't want to reinvent the wheel. Take the best lessons from the IPP program, transplant them into the IF platform. And those are really around certainty, governance, which is transparency, ensuring that there's predictability, ensuring that there's value for money for government. And procurement, I mean, is the major issue in making sure that, the processes are really tight around it. So when I sleep at night, I don't sleep at night and worry. My main worries are more on the side of how do we ensure that we have, this throughput of programs and projects that, the market is looking for. And really the homework is on the government side. And I regard myself as supporting government, even though we are the bridge, where then we get, private sector to, blend and also participate in some of the projects that we are preparing. And fortunately, I mean, my worry again was around creating new institutions. ISA is new, and IF is also new, but in the last, 7 months or so of, one being appointed to this role, one has sensed a lot of traction in both ESA, where, the establishment processes have gone, quite well. Lots of support from even the private sector, where experienced professionals and heads, from the investment side and construction side of the economy are being seconded to support ESA establishment, which has been a great help. And then on our side as IF, we have really moved, with speed to capacitate, the IF. We've got, professionals from, the private sector joining in, also from the public side, blending again, the key skills from public and private, and we are really gearing for business. So for me, I think it's, risks that are well identified that you need to solve for the supply side. And as everyone says, there's no lack of capital to really, participate if we structure and package these programs in an attractive manner. But I mean, the signs are good. As I say, we are not starting with project identification and preparation now. That has been done, well before the IF could be established. And that's why, we are now at a stage where we are, preparing these projects for market, consideration. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohale. I think you mentioned transparency and being transparent to give people confidence in, I guess, what government's setting out for this infrastructure program. I just wanted to touch on that with Anant and Vuyo and get their views on specifically around the question around private sectors and boosting investor confidence into this investment program, and specifically addressing that question that Vuyo had around, I think he contradicted himself around being that there is the opportunity for bankable investment, bankable infrastructure projects for capital to be allocated to. So, and if you look at the triple PPPs, I think there hasn't been anything new projects registered since 2017. Yes, the REAP program was successful, but I think sort of what lessons or in terms of successes, failures that have you guys seen from your experience in SA and in the emerging markets that could sort of add to giving you confidence, giving you comfort to invest in these in projects that government are putting forward as bankable, sort of, and also maybe your views around the sort of financing solutions or blended financing solutions that would help in that regard.
Okay, let me go on this. I think I think there are two parts to the issues that you raised. One is in terms of what is that can be done from bringing in a lot more confidence in terms of bankability. And the second is in terms of, what is happening in emerging markets across, and, are there some lessons that can be learned? I think to answer the first question, I think Vio touched on this briefly. I think there is today an SIP program which is there, which is a good start. And, you have a clutch of projects that investors can look at. I think 2 or 3 things that the government could do to boost that confidence is, one is, if some information can be put out on the preparation and the readiness of these projects, say in terms of land availability, in terms of the reports being ready, the feasibility reports being ready. For example, I remember the Indonesia had set up this KPPIP, which looked at a similar set of projects like the SIP, and would put out an annual report on where these projects are with respect to planning, with respect to preparation of the projects, with respect to structure, so that there is a timetable that is available to investors to know whether some of these projects are moving, some are not moving. And what might happen is, as you move through the preparation of these projects pipeline, you might find within the list of projects that have been identified, some are probably able to move faster. Some requires a lot more teething work in terms of land acquisition, in terms of addressing some environmental issues, etc. So if the government can actually put out saying that, okay, out of the projects that we identified, these are moving faster. So some sort of advance information to investors, I think that would be useful. The second thing that would be useful is also have a very time-bound, preparatory process. I remember, for example, the Philippines PPP Center, not so much now, but around the time they started 7-8 years back, they had a fairly well laid out calendar uh, in terms of empanelment of consultants, completing the feasibility studies. And they, in fact, I remember going to Manila and going to the PPP Center office. On their board, they had a table which said, okay, these were the 20 priority projects we've identified. Where are they? So the PPP Center would be able to sort of put out and say, okay, where is the various projects at from a preparatory standpoint? I think these two things, in terms of prioritizing the list and saying which is moving faster, and having the clear preparation timetable to say, okay, project A is going to come to the market this quarter of this year. If we can put out that kind of a plan, what then happens is investors like Mr. Huyo have some advanced planning and say, okay, can we bring in partners? Who are the people that can bid for these projects? That whole ecosystem, the private sector supply side ecosystem tends to, participate, invest a little ahead of time. And that can sometimes become quite useful. So that is on the bankability and the market sounding part. With respect to overall emerging markets, yes, I think one of you mentioned that since 2017, there's not been much happening. And broadly across emerging markets, there has been a lull on the overall PPP story. And the reasons are not very hard to fathom. I think there has been growth slowdown in several emerging markets. Many governments have had debt to GDP sort of shooting up. And as a result, that the fiscal space available to support PPP projects is also sort of, there is a challenge. So I think multiple factors have come in, but I think that is where I think structured interventions like what South Africa is trying to do with the infrastructure fund, with the project pipeline, can really help boost that paradigm and sort of help move the progress faster. So those were some of the thoughts I had on the bankability part, and addressing this as a programmatic set of projects then sort of helps build confidence and assurance.
Cool. Thanks, Anand. Huyo, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. Thanks, Anand. I mean, I'd like to echo Anand around the fact that progress reports and a clear timetable of when projects will be issued creates that kind of environment where parties start teaming up and prepared. And this further boosts the value for money element that Mohale mentioned, because you then have more bidders for projects who are well prepared and can sharpen their pencils the most, as it were. So I think certainly it would be of great assistance to have that. From a blended finance perspective, I believe that, I think blended finance is not necessarily new in South Africa. I mean, I think if you look at the likes of Gautrain, for instance, while it's not called a blended finance project, the nature of the funding with minimum revenue guarantees, etc., is a form of of blended financing. So I believe viability gap funding has been something that's been in our environment for quite a while. What I do think now is that it will be systematically applied across multiple sectors to create a let me call it an avalanche of projects that we can look at and invest in, hopefully. So that's very positive for us. I think the other issue, though, is obviously, the reason why the fiscus is now looking for private sector support is because certain aspects of the public sector, particularly the SOEs, are undergoing huge financial challenges. And maybe, to some extent, that's probably the root cause. Yes, it creates opportunities for ourselves as investors. But, the fact that you now require blended finance is because the likes of ESCOM, for instance, are not on their own strong from a standalone financing capacity. So while it might not work from a self-serving perspective, I think we should look at what the root cause for requiring blended finance is, and I think in the first instance, obviously some sectors don't lend themselves to pure private sector funding, but at the same time, I think you have projects that in the normal course of things would be self-sustaining that can't be because of where SOEs currently are. So I think we also need to resolve those underlying structural issues as well. And I'd forgotten to mention on Regulation 28 as well, and I'd like to hear Mohale's thoughts on this. Is again, the definition of infrastructure sort of is limited to projects which sit within the SIPs, and obviously the likes of ourselves, when there's been this dearth of infrastructure investment, have been looking at doing infrastructure which sits in the commercial and industrial space, and the likes of embedded generation, the likes of fiber to the home, etc., which is all infrastructure. And per the Regulation 28 definition, some of this infrastructure might not even be considered infrastructure. So that's our other big comment, is that the infrastructure definition should be opened up to all infrastructure, which includes private infrastructure, to create this virtuous cycle where infrastructure businesses can keep themselves going during interregnums, when there's projects that while we wait for projects from government.
Yeah, that's a good point for you. I thought you were going to bring that up when you were talking about Reg 28. So it'll be interesting to hear what Mohale has to say about that from his perspective.
Yeah, no, thanks, Chad. Yeah, I think to Vuo's point, in fact, the earlier point that the amendment of Regulation 28 is clearly a positive step, a good start, and Vuo and I should join hands in lobbying government to further open Regulation 28, because it would be of great help, in fact, to the infrastructure funds programs. So we are in the same boat in that regard, that we agree that it's a first step, which is positive, and it will widen the pool of investors. Obviously, there are still constraints, but when a door is opened, you can then enter and do more than what you could do when it was still closed. So that's our attitude towards that. But if maybe you can allow me, Chad, to also pick up on Anand's point around transparency, creating a portal or a mechanism where investors are continuously briefed through the various stages. That's exactly what we intend to do. We are still fresh, by the way. As I said, we established not more than 6 months ago, but it's exactly what we want to do. Even today, we're engaging with one of the DFIs. They wanted to know more, and we said we can't tell you without having a systematic process. We need to be informing everyone at the same time. So with ISA, we are working on that, and within the next month or so, we should be engaging with the market. And again, learning from the IPP office, again, which we were involved in. We used to have, briefing sessions with various sectors. It would be, it could be developers, advisory companies, and also the banking and investment, sector. So that's exactly what we intend to do. But also, we didn't want to raise expectations before we are certain that projects would go ahead. It's a tricky balance, especially at the beginning. Otherwise, you lose confidence. When we are certain that these projects are irreversible in terms of moving forward, and it will be enough time to allow developers and other interested parties to prep themselves, we will definitely engage. It's our intention. And the issue around preparation, is also very key. ISA is driving that. The DBSA, where I used to be, has got a prep, function, focusing, as I said, on some of the projects that would feed into the infrastructure fund. But I think the problem is bigger than what DBSA on its own could look at. Hence, ISA, as the custodian, the central focal point for infrastructure, is working on other avenues, and really that's where the problem lies. If you address project prep in such a way that you can then attract participants, you have really solved the lion's share of the problem, and that we're not losing focus on as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Marley. I'm just conscious of time, and I want to give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions, and we have a few coming through the Q&A chat box at the moment. If there's any more, please do add them, and we'll try to answer some in the remaining time that we have. But I guess before we go to the Q&A session, just from a structural constraint perspective and actually catalyzing and accelerating that economic growth, we've all seen all of the challenges around some of the licensing issues, for example, around private generation of energy within SA, and the time it's taking to get that implemented and resolved. Or same with the mining exploration and the Resources Development Act, and that being sort of finalized in terms of the mining charter, and that what uncertainty that creates in terms of potential investment. What's I guess let me open up to Vuyo and Anant initially first. Sort of in your experience across, I guess, global and emerging markets, and where your assets are, where you operate your assets, Vuyo, what sort of, what would you see as sort of urgent and sort of bold reforms that need to be implemented within SA to, one, ensure our competitiveness with some of the other regions within Africa, but also to, I guess, drive investment and build confidence for investors to actually place their money into infrastructure projects within SA. So, yeah, what's your thoughts around that, Vuyo?
Yeah, apologies. There's we just had if you can't hear me, there's a big storm in Cape Town, and
oh my God,
it's quite loud. But I mean, from a constraints perspective, I mean, I think it's when kind of policy at one level doesn't necessarily speak to policy on the other hand within kind of the same government, and that's obviously a massive constraint. I think, and I don't want to delve too much into the extent to which private generation is allowed to come on board, but there's obviously been an indication that the private sector is willing to take on more from a power perspective, and we have a shortfall. So the extent to which we continue to rely on Eskom, which is clearly struggling to fill that backlog, is a potential challenge. I do understand, of course, that you also don't want Eskom to suffer through a utility death spiral where all its best paying customers sort of leave the grid. But there needs to be, I think, under circumstances when Eskom is fully able to supply, it's fine to sort of take that position. But when there are shortfalls that need to be filled, I think you need to be a bit more strident in how you shoehorn the private sector into projects. And I think there's an opportunity potentially being lost in the licensing there. And again, it's all about certainty and predictability. I mean, I hate harking back to 2015 when we had a stalled renewable process. We had significant manufacturing capacity established in South Africa around renewables, and over that 4 to 5 year hiatus, A lot of the companies that had been established to manufacture in South Africa actually closed shop as a result of, let's call it a policy failure or a failure of predictability. So it's really about government having kind of a single policy bent and policy strand, and really following through across the board. So so that, you know, Mohale's programs are supported essentially. That's what really needs to happen. Is there needs to be consistency across the board.
I would probably pin this down to possibly 3 areas. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, the heart of, you know, crowding in private investment is your ability to support project recourse financing, right? I mean, either through a fiscal support, either in the form of viability gap funding or availability payments, or getting customers to pay for services. So the combination of these two, how much the budget can support, how much can new fees that customers pay come in. Between these two, from a very simplistic financial standpoint, bankability gets established. So the structural reform side of governments will need to address these 2 levers. So the first lever is the fiscal deficit lever. I mean, at the end of the day, if government is going to run a debt to GDP of 100%, you know, your ability to provide fiscal support to projects gets constrained or, you know, shrunk. So therefore, very clearly, you need to create fiscal space. And for that, obviously, I mean, the African Development Outlook report for 2021 for Africa, for example, identifies its wage reforms or labor reforms, and also kind of addressing the whole debt to GDP as critical elements for creating that fiscal space. The second related element is, are we pricing our infrastructure services right? So as we go down from slightly larger order services for which there is a counterparty to, let's say, sectors like water, where let us say you are increasingly starting to be dependent on the end user paying, whether there is political sort of, sort of buy-in for right pricing services. Is there a clear mechanism of targeted subsidies to sort of address the, bottom of the pyramid, people who can't pay? I mean, obviously, you know, infrastructure services have viability gaps, but can we differentiate people who can pay and who cannot pay and have targeted subsidies? So these 2 elements are core structural reforms that are required for bankable PPP. So this is one bucket, the extent of fiscal space that is available and how much we can generate from user fees and right pricing services. The second area I would say, which is going to be important, is how strong are your counterparties for public-private partnerships. So let's say if I want to do an IPP program, if I have ESCOM as the counterparty, how strong are the counterparties from not just financial standpoint, but from a governance standpoint and from an institutional standpoint? So are we creating credible, capable, and sound financial counterparties for PPP projects? Is the second element I would say is important from a structural reform standpoint. And the third is what we spoke of earlier, which is also what, I mean, it was very heartening to hear Mohale mention that there is indeed a plan to put in place transparency related aspects and getting the programmatic operating nuts and bolts in place in terms of timetables, rollout of projects, etc., which is the whole enabling framework for PPPs and investment climate. In fact, on that score, I think South Africa has a lot of experience. In fact, one of the things I wanted to mention to Mr. Mohale is when we spoke to a few private sector players when we were writing the case study for the REIPP, one of the very positive and resounding, sort of uniform feedback we got was the excellent stakeholder engagement during the course of that program, where, you know, there was a lot of willingness on the part of the government to listen to the private sector view and to sort of factor some of those, inputs into the whole decision-making apparatus, which was very and there was a lot of unanimity when we spoke to the private sector people. That is something that a lot of people mentioned. I like the fact that you also spoke about that aspect. So that is the third aspect. How well can we engage the various stakeholders, do the market sounding ahead of time to ensure that the private sector is fully bought in. These are the three, I would say, are direct structural reform elements. I would probably add a fourth one. South Africa also has a preponderance of SOEs, state-owned enterprises managing a lot of infrastructure, which has also been the case in India. And one of the things India has tried to do, in addition to developing new greenfield projects in infrastructure, the government of India has also been trying to monetize some of the projects which are with the state-owned enterprises and putting out on the block to the private sector from an operating maintenance standpoint, so that there is less riskier projects available for private sector people to participate. For example, in our roads program, the National Highways Authority of India has put out 3 blocks of or 3 bundles of road projects, which has been developed, constructed by the National Highways Authority. It has actually leased out these projects on a toll operate transfer model to the private sector. And interestingly, pension funds have taken a lot of interest in some of those bundles. And so that is one area which I think South Africa should also look at. Existing assets, can some of those be monetized? Now, the advantage of doing that is you will have some upfront capital, which can be then plowed into entities like the infrastructure fund for leveraging further. So building infrastructure, crowding in private investment, both in brownfield assets as well as in greenfield assets, could be a good idea to look at as a fourth dimension of structural. So I'll probably stop here, but these are probably 4 ideas that South Africa can potentially pursue.
Thanks, Anand. Mohale, maybe that's a good point to bring you in again in terms of what Anand was saying, specifically around that the fourth point that he raised around, I guess, the existing SOE infrastructure and the potential, I guess, to bring private sector investment or private sector operations into some of those assets to actually, ensure sustainability, ensure operational efficiency, and ultimately, reducing the government and the fiscal sort of expenditure associated with maintaining those assets. Is that something that as part of the infrastructure fund, as part of Infrastructure South Africa is being considered and potentially will come to the market at some point for investors like a Vuyo to aim to consider?
No, thanks again, Chat. Yeah, I think I'm keen to engage more with Anand and understand better the Indian experience in this regard. But I mean, it makes a lot of sense. Just on the South African front, and again, is an initiative propagated by ISA. Looking at existing buildings. You have in the inner cities lots of buildings that are owned by government and not really occupied, some of them. And the idea is to then involve the private sector to, refurbish and, sort of lease back or a concession to private sector. And then you get the government to then occupy and pay a unitary fee over a period before they revert to government. I guess that could be, a model that could be done across the board. But the one that I'm talking about around government buildings is an initiative that ISA has discussed with us. We may see something, coming out in that regard. But I would engage with Anand to, understand better, and maybe even with ISA, we can have a tripartite, a conversation around that. Yes, yeah. Thanks.
Mohale, and then maybe just to touch on the structural reforms that the guys were sort of mentioning, and that I think is needed to actually catalyze investment into the space. sort of what role is the infrastructure fund playing alongside, I guess, Infrastructure South Africa and government to address those issues and I guess deliver on planned reforms to make it, I guess, worthwhile from a to make it worthwhile for private sector investors to come into these programs, but also then alongside, I guess, the blended finance solutions being developed and considered from the infrastructure fund perspective.
Yeah, no, thanks again. I think, you know, it would have helped to have ISA as part of this panel because I don't want to be speaking a lot for them. You know, it's not within my mandate. But one of their key, mandate areas is, I spoke earlier around, development of the National Infrastructure Plan, which will prioritize projects and so forth. And I also spoke about, 3 buckets of infrastructure projects, those that would be 100% fiscally funded. You have the blended finance ones that would come to us and the fully commercial ones. And the reason why you have the fully commercial ones in this, radar of the infrastructure, of ISA, is to the extent that you need, government unlocking to make sure that they happen. And again, that is the purvey of ISA, And in addition to ISA, there's the Operation Vulindlela within, the National Treasury and Presidency, again meant to, deal with the blockages in various sectors of the economy. But ISA is mainly dealing with the infrastructure sector, and that's really the role that they should play. From the IF point of view, as we are, structuring these projects, we do, feedback to ISA, and advise where we need them to unlock. And it's an area that government itself has committed to, addressing, recognition that there are blockages unintended where you have one regulation on this side meant to achieve certain objectives, but there are unintended consequences arising from that regulation. So there's a concerted effort in that regard. So as the infrastructure fund, our role would be to the extent that you find that there are policies and regulations and even legislation that impede on what we want to do. We have a direct line to engage with ISA and also other government departments like National Treasury, Operation Vulindlela to really unlock. So that's to the extent that we are involved in that regard. Short of speaking on behalf of those who have the private mandate. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mohale. Maybe to bring it back to the infrastructure fund then, and just to understand sort of what are the blended finance sort of solutions, products that are being developed within the infrastructure fund to catalyze and sort of catalyze that 10 times matched funding alongside what government's putting aside. What's being worked on, has been developed, is being considered for the SIPS program.
Yeah, it's a variety of interventions stemming from, and I'm talking practically on the projects that we are looking at, stemming from capital grant, and a simple example would be where a water project is being developed for both economic users and social users, being the community, which would entail indigent elements within that community. So government would then, through the infrastructure fund, contribute capital grant to that, for that social aspect that is meant for users who can't pay because of their situation. So there would be that. In other instances, it would be where we are looking at, enhancing the credit viability of a project through, say, a guarantee. A guarantee could be a form of a standby facility to give confidence that should there be shortage, the IF with other DFIs could come in and step in so that construction can take place. And post-construction, when the project is in operation, we're looking at refinancing via a bond listing, for example. That's what we are looking at. Again, it's a practical project that we are working on. Another project is where we're looking at providing construction capital, because there could be lack of appetite during the construction phase, with the idea that after construction we again get the market to participate when revenues have been proven. And when I say construction, that's where maybe we can bring DFIs alongside the IF. In some instances, we don't even bring government money. We're just a platform to crowd in capital that has got appetite for that portion of asset development, and later bring other players. That's how we catalyze. So at the end of the day, if we succeed in crowding in private sector without spending the 100 billion or spending less of it, that would be success again. So there are a variety of products that we are looking at. In other instances, it could be a first loss facility, mezzanine facilities that we provide to credit enhance some of the projects. Yeah, so it's an open book really from a structuring perspective.
And is that something, Mohale, that I guess will be set out and per project? So from the infrastructure fund side perspective, in terms of the SIBs, are you actually looking at saying, well, this is the potential blended finance solution that is required to make this a bankable, viable investment for the likes of for infrastructure in private investors in infrastructure, or are you keeping it pretty open and will play it essentially by ear in terms of what's needed or required at a particular point in time to attract that investment?
Yeah, no, that's how it is. And we are also, in the process, embedding consultations. And what I didn't mention earlier was that as part of this IF ecosystem, we are creating what we call the Strategic Advisory Committee, consisting of private sector and public sector. We're actually at the final stages, should be in place from June. It's got, experienced, very experienced. So those who used to work, for example, as executives for project finance, say in a bank or in an organization like the one Vuyo is heading, being formally appointed to be part of this, also with the government public sector side. Construction executives, for example, they are part of this ecosystem called the advisory committee, so that we formally test our structuring propositions with them formally, but also informally engaging with various role players. Could be your DFIs if you're looking at the DFI tranche. It could be sessions where we sit with the banking and also the institutional investor community. So that's how we intend to run it, and in a formal way again, so that transparencies are short. But what we would do at the point when we are ready to engage with the market on each project, that's what we'll propose and disclose well in advance that this is how we intend to structure, and in a transparent way we get bids for various players to participate. That's how we intend to do it. So in these projects, for example, that I mentioned high level initially, and now when I talk about structuring possibilities, when we are ready, and will be in this calendar year, that's how we'll engage with the market and say we are looking at a construction facility. Are you keen to partake? These are the proposed terms, and everyone then express their interest or commitment that we will evaluate, and on the basis of that transparency we'll publish what like the IPP office does. This is what we got, and from this one, because they were cheaper than this other a bidder. So that's how we intend to run the infrastructure fund. In a nutshell.
Thanks, Wale. I'm just conscious of time, guys. We've got 15 minutes left, so I think we've got a few questions that have come through on the Q&A chat box, and I think I'll probably just want to turn to those, and then at the end probably just get some closing remarks from each one of you. So this is from an anonymous attendee. So, and it's in relation to the PPPs, PPP projects. So it says SA might be a leader in PPPs in Africa, but uptake in infrastructure of PPPs has been low. Why is this the case? I don't know who from you would like to take it.
Well, I can try. Maybe my colleagues will follow. I think the feedback from the market in general around PPPs. I mean, we really have been innovative as a country, but is the long time that it takes is cumbersome. There are various regulatory hurdles that you've got to go through before a project can be closed. I think that's the feedback. And to that end, National Treasury, again, I'm speaking on their behalf, but we have been involved in the process. They have consulted with us. And I think the World Bank is involved in that initiative where they are looking at streamlining the processes to make them more efficient. And that would certainly entice project owners, largely government departments, to opt into the process, because it's government departments that must voluntarily apply to register their projects. But the issue for them is always the long lead times, and that reform is underway. It's one of the initiatives that Treasury has been leading, and we have been involved. And I think other players in the market were involved. Thank you.
Yeah, and my view is that I suppose it's uptake from the government side, i.e. implementing infrastructure projects as PPPs. And I think it's largely a function of, of need. The truth is, from a fiscal perspective, I think up until around 5-6 years ago, the fiscal space was much wider in South Africa, and the ability of government to self-fund its own infrastructure projects was great. And truly, it's also an issue of control, in that people in departments would rather control the implementation of their projects, and I suppose there's a loss of control to some extent when the private sector steps in to implement. But I mean, I think in those areas where there has been an uptake of infrastructure, the truth is, the regulatory and procurement mechanisms around those have been developed, and you've got centers of excellence within government, as Mohale mentioned, within DBSA, the IPP office, and the PPP unit in Treasury. So I think to the extent that that fiscal space has closed, the procurement mechanics that have been used in the past are obviously now being funneled through Infrastructure South Africa and the Infrastructure Fund. And I think using the lessons that have been learned in the past, it will be easier to create the opportunity for government departments to uptake PPPs as a means of implementing projects. So again, the direction is good.
In fact, I would answer that question slightly differently. I mean, it's sort of a paradox, when governments are fiscally sound, right? They are probably in a better position to do PPPs, right? You're always more likely to succeed in PPPs when governments do it from a position of strength. So when you have fiscal space, you sort of recognize that PPPs are going to get me value for money from an operating efficiency and other considerations. But I have the fiscal space to sort of fund availability payments for making that happen. Governments are more likely to succeed with PPPs. But very often what tends to happen is when the fiscal space is available, government tends to put their own money without leveraging that. And when they eventually get down to do PPPs, often what happens is the fiscal space gets constrained, and the private sector then doesn't want to take the risk appetite because they know the government has a fiscal challenge. So, I mean, it's a sort of a paradox, I think, which governments need to sort of find a way to overcome. And I think that can happen only when you're doing what you're doing right now, which is approach PPPs not purely from a fiscal substitution perspective, but as a strategy. See, I want to do $1 trillion worth of infrastructure program over the next 10 years. Out of this, $300 billion is going to come from the private sector. If you have a programmatic story, chances are the PPP program can then scale. What happens is very often PPPs get focused around and designed around individual projects. And that is where the problem is. And this is not South Africa's specific problem alone. I mean, if you look at emerging markets and the World Bank PPP database, PPPs actually have come down from the heady days of around 2010, where every second project was getting developed on PPP, or at least was talked of on PPP. The honeymoon with PPPs is probably a little over because people understand that it brings with it its own kind of issues. But I think given that the honeymoon is over, people have a more realistic sense of what is possible and what is not possible. And therefore, going forward, I think there is a more sustainable way of creating a good bankable pipeline for PPP. So that is how I would probably answer the question as to why PPPs haven't happened. I'm sorry I took a slightly longer time to answer this, but I thought this was important.
No, sure, that's fine. That's fine, Anand. Thank you for the answer. I do recognize we've only got a few more minutes, and I think I do want to wrap up. So there are one or two more questions, but I think those are ones that we can probably answer via sort of separate responses to the attendees. And maybe may or may not ask for some input from yourselves in that regard. But just maybe as some closing remarks from each one of you around the session. If Wale, I'll admit when I did a bit of research on sort of who you are and what your involvement at the DBSA has been. I came across a interview in 2000 and I think 15, 16 maybe, where the infrastructure sort of rollout and sort of programs and then the National Development Plan, I guess, was spoken to around, getting or catalyzing private sector money into the space. And I think it's been a couple of years on, and there hasn't been that much investment from the private sector into some of these government initiatives and building on the existing infrastructure we have, specifically if you think about Eskom as an example. What's from your perspective, from a personal perspective, from an infrastructure fund perspective, what do you think really needs to change so that we don't have this discussion again, I guess, in another year, 2 years time, rather than speaking to the progress made physically on the ground? And I'll probably ask the same question of Vuyo and Anand.
Yeah, no, thanks again. I think it would be maybe not completely accurate to say there hasn't been anything in terms of investment by private sector into infrastructure. I mean, we've been talking about the IPP program. It has brought close to 200 billion, if not more than that. Obviously, there could have been more, and we have a system that works that we can replicate in other sectors. And to Anand's point, it's usually during a crisis that you become creative and open up to
New ideas.
things that you normally would not have done, in the past. It's precisely because of the constrained fiscal headroom that, government is saying, I've got 100 billion. Can I work with you, private sector, to make it at least, 1 trillion? So it's a crisis that we shouldn't miss, as they say. And I think there's commitment from government, which is always key. I mean, from the top is citizen, the first citizen of the country, very much consistent on what needs to be done. That messaging, you can't take it for granted. It's key. And also from an institutional development perspective. For the first time in South Africa, you have a central platform, to coordinate and plan and unblock, challenges within the infrastructure space. And as one who has been in this space, I mean, through the DBSA and before DBSA, my own, bugbear over the years had been exactly the absence of this central authority, which has now been created in the form of ISA. And this is not a temporary solution. It's institutions that are being put in place, like the infrastructure fund, is not meant to be there for only a few years. And it will become the way in which things are done. Just like you have the IPP program. I mean, if you look at the IPP office, it has seen no less than 8 ministers in the last 10 years, energy ministers. But each and every minister at the end, maybe initially there could be views around it, but at the end of the day, they would see IPP office as an instrument of delivery for their portfolio. Similarly, we need to use this opportunity, the ESAs and the IF as long-term institutions that would be, able to really help the country, achieve its aims from infrastructure development point of view. Yeah, so that would be my take on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Marley. Vuyo, any closing remarks?
Yeah, I mean, my remark is simple. It's we're an entity that's been around for the past 20 years, and I think individually we've been responsible for we've been the largest single investor in the government accommodation PPPs, in the toll road space, and in REI PPP as well. So I think we're a willing partner for government. We think we're a good conduit for South African pension investments into the infrastructure space. And I think the formation of Infrastructure South Africa and the Infrastructure Fund has probably enthused me more than any other development in government in terms of the long-term prospects for our business as an infrastructure investor. So really, it's just a message to say we look forward to engaging and working with government and its agencies to further entrench pension fund investments into the infrastructure space. And really a congratulations to Mohali and his team for establishing the office, and we wish them all the best.
I think I would just keep it very, very short. I mean, when you're looking at sort of the kind of program that South Africa is envisioning and aspiring for, I mean, I normally look at infrastructure programs along 4 I's, if I were to say that. I think the first I is intent. I mean, very clearly there is an intent which is completely and very well laid out. I mean, the president's speech or the initiatives, the $100 billion funding, the setting up of the infrastructure fund, all signals intent very clearly. The second is to look at initiatives, which what I mean by that is, are there programs concretely identified? And the SIP provides that initiative in terms of identifying a clutch of projects which are in place. And the third element you will look at, or the third eye you will look at, is are there institutions which can take up this intent and initiatives and actually take them forward. And on that dimension, we are seeing the coming together of ESA, DBSA, and the new infrastructure fund and the office. Very clearly, this is obviously a great starting point, but I think in addition to this, there is also a need to strengthen the line departments, line agencies. So the whole institutional alignment around this program, this intent and initiative, there is that institutional alignment is what I would call the next I. And the final I, of course, which all of us know is critical to infrastructure, which is implementation. So I would say, how we move on each of these 4 I's will actually help us with the 5th I, which is impact. So I would probably close my remarks saying that, if we get these 4 I's right, we will probably get the 5th I of impact possibly correct as well. So I'd probably close with that.
Thanks, Anand. That's a nice way to close it off in terms of the 4 I's plus 1. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a real eye-opener for me as to what the infrastructure fund's about and what the sort of challenges and opportunities there are for challenges and opportunities around the program are for investors alike. I hope that, I guess, our audience has found it useful as well, and has a bit more of a sense around what the SIPS program is about and what the infrastructure fund's about. Thanks again for your time. Appreciate it, and have a great day further. Likewise to the audience.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much,
thanks.
Chad, and it's a pleasure interacting with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Chad.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mohale. Cheers.